Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. In this video, I'm going to continue the analysis into Nietzsche's Will to Power. Specifically, I'm going to discuss section 4 in the notes. With that, let's begin. Okay, so this is Will to Power. And this is section 4. Okay, section 4 is going to cover notes in Nietzsche's text, which is, where's the text? I'm using the Walter Kaufmann edition of, the Walter Kaufmann translation of Nietzsche's The Will to Power, and it's going to cover notes 16 through 34 in this text. If you have other texts, other versions, if the notation system is the same, then it's notes 16 through 34. Okay, what we saw in the last section was an attempt to discuss how those who are in control of the moral imperative, known as the value positors, posit moral imperatives as a means of implicitly controlling individual subjects, right? So the individual subject buys into the value. That value is a buy-in to the system of values, hence the moral imperative. That is a buy-in to the charismatic leader. That charismatic leader then uses his charm in addition to the value system to control the values that the individual ascribes to, and ultimately the beliefs that the individual shares. Insofar as the individual beliefs are controlled, the value positor is invariably able, as the discussion progressed, to control the level of rejection that the individual being controlled has to the world. The greater the level of rejection, the greater the level of detachment from the world, obviously the more dangerous the individual becomes, because I no longer see any humanity in the world. Everything around me is dehumanized. My life is meaningless. There is no value to life, and hence, this individual becomes very, very destructive. What we're going to do in this discussion is to talk about a few things: failure. We're going to talk about disappointment and the relationship between a lot of these concepts, and specifically in a technical sense, in relation to the concept of nihilism. So let's begin. The first is the idea of disappointment. So disappointment and the denial of apotheosis. The word apotheosis, this is on page 8 of the notes. The word apotheosis just means sort of the divination of a man or a woman, right? The attempt to become a god as a mortal. So it's my becoming a god, my becoming divine. The term is apotheosis. So disappointment, D-I-S-A. Disappointment and the denial of... Okay, so disappointment and the denial of apotheosis. The first point to recognize is the highest, according to Nietzsche, the highest desiderata, the highest sort of schema, the highest criteria, the highest aspect of this process that we're attempting to understand, the highest value, were conceived as God at the apex of a given truth. Right? So the highest value is conceived as God at the apex of a given truth. Right? So we have the idea that God is at the apex, at the pinnacle of a given truth. This comes from note 17. Right? So the highest desiderata, the highest value, were conceived as God at the apex of a given truth. Right? We discussed earlier the idea that the moral imperative is structured in such a manner that once it is attained, right, once the highest value is attained, whatever that value might be, then it devalues itself. It collapses on itself. We all know that Nietzsche, and I'm not going to get into the whole death of God discourse because it doesn't pertain now, but you can imagine if we have God at the apex as the highest value, and he says specifically God at the apex of a given truth, then similarly, at this apex, the highest values devalue themselves. There is a sense in which that this notion, this conception of the divine according to Nietzsche, collapses also in on itself, right? The next is a quote from Nietzsche. This comes from a different note, note 15. To become as God, right? To become as God, to be absorbed into God. For thousands of years, these were the most naive and convincing desiderata. This is note 17, right? To become as God, right? To be absorbed by God. And let's look at exactly where this is. Page note 17, so we can follow along in the text. It's on page 15 of the Kaufman text. So on page 15 of the Kaufman text, number 17, note 17, sort of midway down, it says God, in parentheses, God at the apex of a given truth. To become as God, to be absorbed into God. For thousands of years, these were the most naive and convincing desiderata. But what convinces is not necessarily true. It is merely convincing, a note for asses, right? So the idea that there is this notion of a divine head, a God, and just like we said before with respect to the moral imperative, you'll see the structure is the same, right? You have what ought to be the case, you have what is the case, and there's a progression from is to ought. Similarly, there's a progression from the facticity of my humanity, if you will, to this notion of divinity. And I want to move from a human state to a divine state, right? I want to, I'm progressing through this process of apotheosis, and what Nietzsche said in 17, to become as God, right? This process of becoming as God, to be absorbed into God, right? So the direction is towards, to be absorbed into God. For thousands of years, these were the most naive and convincing desiderata, right? This is what everybody wanted. Everybody wanted to be like God. Next point, bullet point number 3, so that's number 2. Bullet point number 3 is the influence of too much coddling. This is actually a great quote, right? Let me find the note itself. 15. If I can find it. I don't think I underlined it. Is it note 15? The influence of too much coddling. I should have underlined it in my text. Where is it in 17? Yeah, I'll have to try and find that. But it's I thought it was in 15. Consider the most extreme forms of consider no, it wasn't 15. I have to change this in my notes because this was wrong. What I have. It's not 15. The citation somewhere in here says the influence of too much coddling is stronger than the wrath of disappointment. Right? It's in disappointment. Maybe it was 16. Yeah, in 16. Let me change that. Note 16. I put it wrong. Bullet point 3 should be note 16. The last line on page 15, note 16, says, the influence of too much coddling is stronger than the wrath of disappointment. Right? What ends up happening is we, as the agent, are coddled, right? Are protected, are comforted by this direction, right? By the telos, by the goal, right? We're comforted by this warm and fuzzy feeling. I'm not trying to make light of it, but we're comforted by this notion that we will be as God, right? We will be in a place of the absence of pain, right? We will be in a place of perpetual happiness, right? That notion, these conceptions, this moral imperative, this apex sort of ideology comforts us. It coddles us. But insofar as we aspire as individual human beings for the divine, and these notes look really messy, we aspire for these notions of the divine, then we're not really properly right? We're sort of directed towards this apotheosis, this divination of the human being. And as he says in bullet point 3 is number 16, I have to make sure I change that. Last sentence in note 16, the influence of too much coddling is stronger than the wrath of disappointment, right? So we collapse